Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Eric Rush. I am fortunate enough to kick off our reboot of the podcast here, and I'm joined by a group of friends here. So I will have everybody go around and introduce themselves, and then we'll also introduce our topic for today. So Chris, would you like to say hi to the good people?
Hi to the good people.
And we have Dylan here today.
Hey everybody, how's it going?
And we have Robert.
Hello.
And last but certainly not least, we have Eric Darling Bond, who is frozen at the current time, but hopefully will unfreeze for the rest of the podcast, because that will actually be very important. So we hope that everybody has weathered well through our little hiatus. I think the Fork in Time team has had a lot of life happen to us over the past few months. So for those who are joining us, we really appreciate you sticking with us, and we are excited to get the podcast rebooted. We are planning to have our weekly podcasts like we have been for the past few years, and so we're excited to get that going. We're also excited to get a Room Where It Happened up and going, so we will have both podcasts. So today we have maybe a little bit of a lighter subject to reboot our podcast. And so so who would like to introduce our subject for the day? Dylan, I'm going to volunteer you.
Yeah, so basically the idea is we're going to kind of combine our love of trying to find ways to stop or screw up World War II with a little bit of pop culture to keep things light. So today, basically what we're going to do is we're going to explore the idea of what if arguably one of the progenitors of sort of the gentleman spy concept had died before he could execute his idea as part of his intelligence operations in World War II. So we're going to be exploring what if the great Ian Fleming had died in the midst of World War II while executing intelligence operations before he could begin to sort of flesh out this idea of the most iconic gentleman spy, a certain James Bond 007. Did I sum that up?
Yeah. No, I think you summarized that very nicely, and so we know that Ian Fleming wrote his books largely from experience. I mean, again, there was certainly a lot of fiction involved there, but this is a person writing about spies who was absolutely himself a spy, and a spy doing a lot of dangerous things during a dangerous time, and so there's any number of ways that he could have died much earlier, and because I think if I recall correctly, he survived until the mid-60s. But in this case, the what we are painting will not have him survive until the mid-60s. So as we always do on A Fork in Time, when we talk about the what if, we always precede that talking about the what did. So could we just take a little bit of time, guys, and talk about a little bit about who Ian Fleming was, maybe a little bit about his pre-author history as a spy, and a little bit about what he wrote, not just James Bond, but of course Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But so he was prolific with his James Bond series, and so guys, who was even Ian Fleming?
So I'll go ahead and kick off. He known author, but during World War II, he actually served as part of the naval intelligence. He was actually I always get my numbers mixed up. MI5 is the correct?
No, I actually think I said that wrong.
MI6.
I think 6 is foreign.
6 is the foreign. That's right. I always get those two
counter.
flipped.
Yeah.
So it was actually part of MI6, but he actually served as part of the 30th Commando Unit, who put together a lot of Operation Mincemeat to conceal Italy's invasion. did a lot of behind the scenes analyst type work with the spies, kind of setting it up. After he retired, just kind of jump quickly ahead. He retires and he starts writing novels based on his experiences. And he writes a series of books that all of us have come to know and love called James Bond, The Gentleman Spy. And so he writes those as he moves forward. And those then get picked up and adapted to the movies, most notably starring Sean Connery to begin with, who moves on to one with David Niven, and then into Roger Moore, and then Timothy Dalton. Let me get my Bonds correct. Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and then Daniel Craig, if I got them all correct. And one of the best and most successful film series of all times, the gadgets, the fun, all the good stuff that we've come to know and love about spy movies and fun action and all of that. But they all start with Fleming's novels. And so the problem is Fleming didn't start writing novels until after World War II. And so he has to make it through World War II to get started with the novels. So I think that kind of sets us up where we're going. Massive influence on pop culture in a lot of ways with the James Bond novels. They influence, movies were one-offs. There weren't a lot of sequels or series kind of things. Then all of a sudden Bonds kind of started rolling up and, we can set it up. And then you have the James Bond will return at the end of the movie, which, for our modern young movie theater goers, the first time anybody ever saw that Thanos will return thing was when James Bond will return showed up on our screens. So kind of sets us up to see what happens. So Eric, back to you.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great summary. And what was the first James Bond novel?
I always get them out of order. Someone help me out here.
Looking that up right now.
I was trying to remember, and I'm going to have to look.
The first one is Casino Royale.
Now you mean novel
book.
released, not movie released?
No, yeah, the first novel is Casino Royale. The one offshoot non-Sean Connery American quote unquote James Bond movie is Casino Royale 2, but we can get into that later.
We can get into that
starring
later.
Peter Sellers.
Yep.
Oh yeah, So yeah, so we have this person who's writing these novels post-war, and this becomes a movie franchise and a whole archetype. And so I think, at this point we all understand that conceptually this archetype of the gentleman spy based on James Bond, and there's been an infinite amount of derivative works that have been based on this. So so the what if in this case is, what if that didn't happen? So we are saying, what if Ian Fleming never wrote these novels? And there's a variety of different ways that we could make that happen. But here on A Fork in Time, we prefer to do the things very neatly and just kill people off early.
Yes, so very much like an intelligence service. We prefer our executions clean and calculated.
Absolutely. The only time we've saved any human in this entire podcast is during the British royal family episode where we managed to save Diana.
Not true.
Oh, okay.
We did an episode where we saved McKinley.
Okay.
Oh, I remember
that. Oh boy, William McKinley.
So we have,
what an impact he had on history.
So we have an extensive A Fork in Time body count. And that is a weighed against Princess Diana and William McKinley only. So, listener, please do your math on that. So we like to do things very cleanly here, and so how could we do that here? And just so everybody knows, before we actually record, there is we usually for 20 or 30 minutes just chat. And a lot of that's just sort of catching up because we haven't seen each other for a little while, but also a lot of it is coming up with our strategy for the episode. And so what we all agreed on is there are a lot of ways you could kill Ian Fleming in World War II. Dangerous guy, dangerous times. But we did decide on one, And Chris, was this yours or that we decided on?
I think the two real solutions. Well, Robert jumped in as soon as I started, because I can't actually get to the point. When I started going down the road to the point, Robert jumped and saw exactly where I was going both times.
Robert does help us get to the
yes.
That's that.
But what we decided, kind of a Kitchener situation.
Okay.
He was going to a conference in Jamaica in the, I want to say, summer of 1942, when the Atlantic was not exactly ours.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody on a boat in the Atlantic in 1942, I mean, if we see you, we're probably using that to kill you off on this podcast.
It's at your own risk. Not a good place. So okay, so what exactly happens then, guys?
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. He's on a Royal Navy destroyer heading towards Jamaica to attend a conference on intelligence cooperation with the newly formed OSS, the newly entered United States, who hasn't had a chance to clear out its lake yet. And he gets sunk by a German U-boat, which are newly operating in American waters. Or should I say continental, in waters near the United States, because now they can be all over this instead of worrying about angering the United States again. Right.
So, okay, so waters close by the U.S. So he's sunk, and at this point he's sort of he's not particularly high ranking. He's a lieutenant commander at this point, something like that.
We don't know him. Nobody knows him at this point.
Nobody knows him.
He is a behind the scenes analyst who has managed to worm his way in to do things and has a decent reputation, but yeah, that's about it.
I think the best way to describe it, I immediately jumped to say he's kind of like a Jack Ryan analyst, and I'm like, oh wait, that's a horrible example, but at least he's what Jack Ryan keeps pretending he is, I guess. That he's flying the desk.
His dad knew Winston Churchill. They were both members of Parliament. And when Ian Fleming's father was killed during World War I, Winston Churchill wrote his obituary for his dad.
Okay. So he's not totally a nondescript human, but his death doesn't necessarily make major waves.
No. There are several boys' preparatory schools where the headmaster is having a celebration because he was kicked out of many of them for having multiple girlfriends brought over on school grounds and trying to start gambling rings. So, it's a mixed bag.
A mixed bag indeed. So, okay, so some celebration in some British boarding schools.
Who hasn't been there?
Sounds like a British Richard Nixon.
Yeah. As a man of the people, I have not been to a boarding school.
I was going to say, so he's basing characters on real life is what I just heard as he moves on. Not just the spy part, but all the other parts too.
Yep. Well, very good. So, okay. So he's gone. So because he's a nondescript analyst in British intelligence, on the macro level, nothing happens differently with the war, right? It proceeds as it did, but then all of a sudden, actually not all of a sudden, there's no all of a sudden. There's just life. And so what happens?
Man, it's really sad that we started this off by basically saying Ian Fleming did not make much of an impact on one of the most important war efforts. Let's continue.
Well, I think it's just that his impact has already happened, because I mean he had he was kind of one of the big brains behind the whole sort of kernel of the Operation Mincemeat idea, where they throw the dead body with the fake message on the beach in Spain, and the Germans find it, and blah, 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 blah. And then somehow, ipso facto, Italy's open.
and I just read that he suggested it should be called Dead Body in the Water, and we killed him at sea. And oh god! All right,
Yeah.
let's try to clean.
I think World War II is clearly where he's working on his naming conventions, and he hasn't gotten it right down yet. So, even depending on what happens, spy novels are not as excitingly named. I think probably the most important thing that we have to get out of the way is that if Ian Fleming, I correlate them so well in my head. If Ian Fleming dies in World War II, there is a very upset American ornithologist, or he's not upset because he doesn't realize how famous he's going to end up being. But there is an American ornithologist who is very much less famous than he is in our timeline, just for the sake of having the name of James Bond.
Oh my god, my childhood would be so much easier when meeting people. Okay, never mind. I'm happy that we've done this.
So
can I ask,
Eric? Can we do we want to dig into this more? I mean, would you?
Listen, it's just very tiring. Listen, you tell someone your last name is Bond, and it's almost automatically like, oh, like James Bond, ha ha ha. Why didn't your parents name you James? Ha ha ha. And it goes on for a while. I had a teacher call me Bond Eric Bond, because she liked the Pierce Brosnan series with the Russian mob boss. But anyway, back to Ian Fleming, who we're talking about. So Chitty Chitty Bang Bang does not exist.
No, it does not. But yet we will always hunger for fiction. We will always hunger for something exciting to read, exciting to watch on the big screen. So what happens there? Is it true that there's just no like the whole idea of the spy doesn't really catch on, or what happens?
It's this. Well, looking at the spy fiction of the time, it's all like Graham Greene and Dennis Wheatley, who's a lot of guys who are either like serious spies with very serious lives, like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with Graham Greene, or stuff that's kind of coming out of the pulp. So it's just like, is it fun to still read about spies? Because, there's also the Cold War happening. So spy fiction, I think, does happen. Maybe it's not the gentleman spy, as Dylan called it, coming into the forefront, but is it just more of a stone cold bummer of just like, yes, we are engaged in morally gray activities between us and the Russians?
I think it's going to be a little more, I hate to use this phrase, but I think it's going to be a little more American in sort of like this stereotypical sense of the word. Because
I agree.
If you have Ian Fleming sort of, and kind of, John le Carre also doing sort of the same kind of thing, this sort of staid British, like gentleman, suave, understated sort of behind the scenes spy stuff. I think the other option that you're going to be left with is this sort of post, Humphrey Bogart film noir. It's going to be more kind of like a John Wayne kind of spy movie where it's all Americans, rah, 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 let's blow some stuff up and we're right because communism is bad. Much less covert, more kind of overt, sort of feel good, just sort of, for lack of a better word, that's less literal, bombastic kind of spy movie. You sort of have the, I envision it as sort of the noir in the 40s and early 50s, and then you sort of go into the John Wayne sort of Western thing. And as that kind of gets played out, you can sort of transition that into a sort of World War II spy movie, because by the time the Western stuff gets played out in the 50s and early 60s, you've had enough time for all of these American commandos who would have been in the OSS and the early versions of a lot of these Cold War spy agencies and stuff have time to come back and start writing their memoirs of World War II that you may end up seeing turned into sort of the inspiration for, for lack of Ian Fleming, the sort of basis for a lot of these Cold War spy thrillers. But it's going to be a lot less behind the scenes and more, we're just going to go shoot a bunch of Ruskies in an embassy somewhere and go blow some stuff up.
So Dylan, you mentioned John Wayne, and I think that's, and I get that, but I'm going to throw out another name that I think really fits what maybe you and I are thinking of, and that's Steve McQueen.
Yeah, because he could go straight from sort of the Great Escape
Great
kind of
Escape.
thing.
That's exactly where my head went. I was like, the way you're talking
Yeah.
about it is like, I know it's not exactly a spy movie.
No,
this-
but that's what could start it off, and that kind of thing leads into a more sort of espionage focused kind of thing.
Yeah.
If you really think about another movie of that time, I think The Dirty Dozen.
The Dirty
as
Dozen.
as a behind the lines commando group, like that has an intelligence aspect to it.
Yeah.
So I guess,
absolutely. And so you've got, so now you not only do you have Steve McQueen, now you've got, Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson, other people that are kind of in that. I think these are kind of our archetypes for what does that American spy look like. I feel this. Like I totally get.
Do we end up having like Dirty Harry go to Europe and start trying to find some guys in a back alley?
I'm pretty sure they made that movie. It's called Firefox.
Oh,
that was great movie, Chris. and yeah, that would actually be that actually would be a really good example of what Firefox is, the prototypical American spy movie.
Yes.
By the way,
made for the Cold War.
Just to explain to people what that is, because that's a bit of a deep cut I just made. Clint Eastwood is an American pilot who has to learn Russian because he's going to go steal a Russian like superjet that can read your mind. So he has to learn how to think in Russian so that the plane will understand his like neural commands. Is that basically what this is?
Yeah, that's basically
Correct.
what it is. And it's like, it's this plane that obviously never existed. They called it, what do they call it? Like the MiG-31 or something like that.
MiG-31, Mach 6.
Yeah.
And stealth before stealth.
Yeah, it was crazy. Like it was all the things that you would want in a plane rolled into one, and it read your mind, but only in Russian.
So I'm going to throw something out here just to sort of, because for the sake of argument, I feel like we need a sort of American analogy to Ian Fleming, just to kind of keep the conceptual timeline kind of on the rails. And, if we kind of stretch out these different eras, there is an American author who kind of lines up with sort of a sort of delayed Ian Fleming sort of spy novel career, and that's Robert Ludlum.
Yeah.
Because his first book came out in 1971. And for people who don't know, he is the guy who ends up writing the Bourne novels that become the basis for the movies that Matt Damon, made a big deal out of. So we can use him as sort of our Ian Fleming by proxy for this sort of more bombastic, kind of more blue collar working man sort of James Bond equivalent. He could even still be a James Bond because that's a very purposefully sort of, American, British kind of everyman name. Or if you really wanted to go point, we could just say he's John McClane for the sake of entertainment. But,
yeah. Well, and Robert Ludlum, he wasn't a spy, but wasn't he? He was in the military though, in the U.S. military, wasn't he?
He was a Marine actually. I think in World War II is what branch he was. So he did have the military experience and sort of the operational know-how to be able to put some of this realism into his novels.
So, if he's a Marine, he's a very hands-on, boots on the ground, it really kind of antithetical to the James Bond aristocratic sort of spy. He's going to be a very, we'll call it small d democratic sort of an intelligence officer.
This is who America produces.
Mm-hmm.
The United States didn't really have a history of dedicated intelligence. We did have a history of, Morgan's Rangers, special operations, small units during all of our wars, but professional intelligence did not exist. So that's kind of an outgrowth of American society as opposed to an outgrowth of British society.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think this is who the U.S. produces, and
So
okay, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
yeah, just to ask this to the people around. Yes, the United States produces these. Is there a another British author? Is there somebody that kind of fills a British perspective of this? I'm thinking kind of about, if we think about and we didn't make this connection, but the British invasion, that kind of rediscovery of our cousins across the ocean in the early 1960s. I think Ian Fleming and his novels are part of this, but is there
I would say, for the sake of just temporal consistency, probably the most famous one that we could easily slot in, and I'm mostly saying this because Ian Fleming dies in the sort of, in the 1960s, kind of right as the James Bond stuff pops off. But John le Carre, or Le Carre, I can never quite figure out how to say it. He survived until 2021. He just recently passed away within the last couple of years, so he could end up being, in this sort of alternate universe, this sort of standard bearer for a kind of British, he's not as much of the gentleman spy kind of thing, but he's in that sort of vein.
Just because in, like, you picture 65, 66 in the United States, if you have a British accent, you are getting access to places.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think those spy things, those take off, because I think it really takes the movies.
Yeah, I think so too.
To make it.
But that was
I think Fleming's novels become a big deal, but not until Dr. No is on film with Sean Connery.
Yeah. I think what you're going to end up having happen is, instead of sort of a British, sort of film industry coming up out of the novels of Ian Fleming, I think you end up having, sort of a natural American outgrowth as sort of the Western dies. The Hollywood machine picks the sort of American spy thriller as the next thing to kind of come into. And as that sort of kind of gets, produced into the ground in, say, the late 70s, just to kind of keep your typical sort of machine Hollywood trend kind of pattern going, you can have a sort of British outgrowth to that, which conveniently tracks because you have guys like John le Carre start to have 10, 15 novels under the belt that you can have sort of these more, restrained gentleman spy productions of, to sort of combat, give a breath of fresh air to a Hollywood that's now kind of like, oh yeah, we've seen Clint Eastwood go to, Monte Cassino and punch Nazis for the 8th movie in a row now. We don't need to see that anymore. Let's get something different. So I think that's kind of where it ends up. The other thing that I just, as a musician, kind of want to point out is, do we have, and this is kind of just an abstract question that doesn't really have a good answer, but without Ian Fleming, do we have the sort of iconic movie theme song as it exists today, without sort of the James Bond, Live and Let Die, Skyfall, that iconic soundtrack? Do we have something like that, do you think? Does it become a sort of pop culture measuring stick? Do Robert Loveland's Bourne movies, get Paul McCartney to start writing the theme song, or does that kind of die as a concept?
I don't think necessarily it dies. It may not be that these kinds of movies, are the vehicle for it.
I agree.
But I think about, if we're, what's coming out contemporaneous to Dr. No as a movie? Jailhouse Rock.
Had to bring Elvis into this, didn't you?
Okay.
Well, I just
like that.
That's perfect, because he would be a perfect sort of American spy movie character.
I wasn't even suggesting that. I was just more of a, like,
the idea of the music vehicle, the Hard Day's Night, the Jailhouse Rock, things like that.
We've mentioned Casablanca. Like, as time goes by, you hear that song, you think of that movie. Even before we just killed off Ian Fleming, that, like, as soon as you have sound with movies, you have this connection made.
So, but I think just because you did that,
of the particular prestige that goes along with being chosen for the soundtrack, and that choice being very much reflective of sort of the zeitgeist, being that is kind of indicative of the feel of the movie. I mean, you can kind of go down the list, and I could tell you who the artist was, who was the kind of the theme song for that movie, and you could probably tell me the movie, not because you remember it, just by the year that artist was popular.
Yeah. So here's another thing that I just thought of, and this is more because of the sort of James Bond. So obviously Sean Connery probably doesn't become sort of eponymous with James Bond, but more broadly speaking, the James Bond movies were, at least to what I can think of, one of the first series of movies that kind of was sort of serialized and had multiple sequels. The only thing that I can really think of before that is like, some spaghetti westerns like the Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name trilogy, where you kind of know he's the same character, but they never expressly state it because they don't know if they want to connect all these movies together. So do you think if we don't have an Ian Fleming James Bond situation, putting aside maybe a Bourne trilogy kind of concept, do we have the idea of sort of like a serialized movie with sort of multiple extended storylines that chain up, or is that something that sort of stays only in the realm of TV?
The other thing I was going to throw out, because you brought it up, Dylan. Well, Chris brought it up. Does Elvis start to play a spy at some point in his career? He sees that as a way to be a more serious actor, because that was one of his big deals. He wanted to be
I think that would certainly be
actor.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be the way that if he were to do that, he would do it. Because just to keep the explanation short, so he ended up going in King Creole because James Dean passed away. That was seen at the time as his big serious movie shot, and then the producers changed it to a musical production. But if you have this sort of American spy movie complex that's going, he's also perfect because, well, he was in the army in the 1950s. He was a tank driver, so he understands that sort of military jargon and bearing and that attitude. So he could end up being kind of the sort of franchise, assuming he can get away from the musical side of it, the sort of franchise spy movie, action hero to keep things going. I like that. I kind of like that idea.
Yeah, I do too. It's interesting. It's one of those things. At first, it feels like, I mean, Elvis, come on, and then you think about it, and you're like, okay.
I'm actually going to bring up another movie that comes to mind, and I think this is one we talked about off podcast. Longest Day is, yes, what Sean Connery's career would be without James Bond, but I don't know if people know who Fabian is. And also Paul Anka. They were two kind of teeny bopper picture, like early, and they came out and played Army Rangers in that movie, doing exactly what we just said, trying to masculine up and grow up their image.
And played both those parts very well, as I recall from the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at Dylan's face, like how Chris is just doing the deep movie cuts right now.
Yeah, I'm a movie guy, and those are kind of even beyond me, but that might just be my age. I don't know. I will say though, and I made this joke before we started recording, but I just want to say it again because it's too good to not put it in the live version. It does make me sad that we don't have The Rock as an unofficial James Bond movie now. If Ian Fleming dies, because Sean Connery no longer plays an old James Bond who gets thrown into prison and then has to teach Nick Cage how to sort of save the day. Unless you imagine it as sort of somehow we shoehorn that in as Nick Cage being the last dying gasp of this American spy movie phase.
So if we are really trying to serialize this, go ahead and fit Con Air into this.
So that's what we do, is instead of, we do a reverse The Rock where Nick Cage plays the old American spy who's framed in prison, and you have like Pierce Brosnan or somebody, or a young Daniel Craig, be the guy who's in Nick Cage and Con Air with the accent and the hair, and just come save the day. And that's how we flip it. And bada bing, bada boom, we're good to go. Everything's back to normal.
So
and then you get
no
rock. And I threw out some long term. I mean, you don't get the classic American TV series, The Man from U.N.C.L.E.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get Smart with Don Adams, which to this day as a child, that was one of my pleasures on Saturday evening when nothing else was on. They would play Get Smart.
Yeah. Or do you get a version of that is that what starts the sort of British response? Do you get it from TV instead of movies on the British side of things?
Potentially. But do you also lose Bill Cosby because there is no I Spy?
Yeah, there's no I Spy. There's no Austin Powers. There's no Johnny English. All gone.
I don't know about there not being any Austin Powers, because I can see, Mike Myers being able to turn the sort of Canadian kind of outsider's perspective just as easily on an American sort of braggadocio spy as he could on a British gentleman spy. I think it just would be a different Austin Powers.
But it would be something different. It would not be Austin Powers. It wouldn't even it wouldn't resemble. It wouldn't resemble Austin Powers in any way. I don't know what we would call it, but yeah, could Mike Myers, with his ability for comedy and accents, figure out something? I mean, anybody who's seen So I Married an Axe Murderer can say yes, he could figure something out.
He would think of something.
He would think of something.
So I promised us. We talked about all of our ideas off podcast, but I promised you guys I was going to drop one.
Okay.
Live.
Do
it. Fleming's books create this idea of a superior British intelligence. Very much in all of the movies, he's kind of like the guy who knows what's going on, and the Americans are almost his little brother, nipping at their heels, wanting to come along and play.
Right.
Without that impression created, United States intelligence did cooperate very closely with the British. If they don't have this almost inferiority put in their head, how effective are the Cambridge Four? For those of you following along at home, or who may not be familiar, James Bond, Mr. Gentleman Spy, it turns out that you couldn't swing a dead cat in MI6 in the 1950s without hitting somebody who was a secret communist.
So
they were very well penetrated by Soviet intelligence.
So think about Ken Philby as being the most common of those. Yeah. Interesting. I don't know. Is there an effect there? I mean, what does everybody think?
I think there might be, in that, let's be honest, you, Eric, do you want to share your story of kind of the family connection to how we knew they wouldn't turn on us?
Oh, yeah. So, so my paternal grandfather was in, he was, he since passed a couple of years ago. Fortunately, he lived a very, very long life. But he was in World War II and I don't think I'm breaking any. I mean, he's gone, so it's not like the government can get mad if they don't like us talking about this. But he was a OSS during World War II, and dirty tricks and killing Nazis and the kind of thing you do when you're an American in the OSS during World War II. But then, as we demobilized from the OSS, and a lot of things became in the US a lot more institutionalized. So much of what we did, especially early in the war, was very ad hoc, because we didn't really have a lot of these organs in place because of our previously isolationist policy. And so the OSS was in many ways thrown together, and by Wild Bill Donovan and a few others. Not to say that it wasn't effective in some ways, but it was done fairly quickly. In any event, so those people who were retained from OSS into either intelligence in the nascent CIA or in law enforcement in entities like the FBI were people who were under some amount of scrutiny because they wanted to make sure that they were loyal to the US government. And so, my grandfather was considered to be a very safe option because he was a good Irish Catholic boy. And, Irish Catholic boys are never going to betray us to the communists. And they weren't wrong. I mean, my grandfather was very much a patriot and anti-communist, so he was a good bet. Now he ended up going into the Kansas Highway Patrol and not the FBI, but he was still in law enforcement. But the point still holds is, as a government, who's loyal and how do you know that? And for a lot of these folks that were in MI6, we didn't know that.
And so there was a level of trust we assumed with the British because they've been at this for hundreds of years. There's no way they have leaks,
right?
Except they did.
Like a sieve.
Yes.
Well, and so maybe that's the question. Do you think that in a situation where, the sort of American pop culture of it doesn't create this understanding that, oh, the British and the Americans are on the same side, who do we turn to? Does it then become sort of like
not even on the same side, just this idea that the British
just not connected?
No. We're still connected. We're still cooperating. There's still the relationship there, but this conception that the British, like anybody who talks with a British accent, you can drop them in any situation with like a pen, with a joke shock pen, and they will somehow save Western civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what if we replace just extrapolating in reverse? There's a good segment of the American population that is of Scots-Irish descent. What if instead of a sort of staid British person, instead we have it be sort of people from Scotland or Ireland who the Americans decide to use as sort of their cover. And all of a sudden, if you decide to start dropping somebody with a Scots Highland accent in the middle of Britain, they're going to be able to fight the commies without anybody knowing about it. Just turn the pop culture on its head a little bit.
Interesting.
I'm just curious.
Any thoughts, Chris and Robert?
I hadn't thought about the Irish doing that, because that does drop a whole new world on it.
See, the thing I'm not sure about is, listen, watching American films from this time period, you can tell they're a foreigner if they have a British accent. Period. So
it's the Star Wars thing where all the bad guys have British accents, all the good guys have American accents. Yeah.
So I am not sure that the average American viewer at this time understands the complexities of United Kingdom accents.
Okay. Well, so I just thought of this. How about this instead?
I also would say this, to get to Eric's point of staffing FBI counterintelligence and OSS with Irish Catholics may mean they're anti-communist. If there's one people that are pretty far up there on their list, it's British aristocrats.
They didn't love it. They didn't love it.
Yeah. What about instead? What if if Americans have this kind of sort of guns blazing sort of attitude to international, at least in the American pop culture sense, this sort of highfalutin guns blazing attitude to international espionage, quote unquote, from the pop culture understanding of it. Do you think that makes it easier for the Soviets and sort of Soviet related, even potentially British intelligence to get not necessarily more of a foothold, but to move more sort of unobserved. Because if there's less of this understanding of, okay, the British are automatically sort of these super spies and we work super closely with them, they're just kind of seen as sort of different, but nobody knows quite why. There's not as much of a sort of hand in glove kind of relationship. Do you think that gives a sort of McCarthyist Red Scare era of the 1960s and maybe 70s sort of
Does Reagan get the 76 nomination at the Republican Party is your question.
Okay. Robert. So this is quite a butterfly here. We kill Ian Fleming by a U-boat in 1942, and now Reagan wins in 76 the nomination. Interesting. You're gonna have to unpack that for us, Robert. I like it.
So think where Dylan's going. So it's more accepted that we're guns blazing against the Americans. Communism is, because James Bond, if you think through James Bond and the novels and everything else, especially by the time he gets to movie adaptations, the communists aren't the bad guys. It's Spectre, whoever they are. They're the Al-Qaeda of James Bond. So, but if we stay with pure Americanism, the communists are the bad guys all the way through. So the American public is much, much more predisposed to jump on Reagan's evil empire because he was anti-communist all the way through, starting early. And even Nixon was perceived really as a staunch anti-communist. That's why only Nixon could go to China to do it. True. So it predisposes the cultural impact, predisposes the American public to more readily jump on the Ronald Reagan bandwagon in 76.
Okay, so two thoughts about that. One is the movie that's being described is True Lies.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, that's the movie that's being described. And I will say, like, that movie came out in high school. I really enjoyed it. It's not good cinema, and I'm doing air quotes for those of you who are just listening. It's not good cinema, but it's very enjoyable. And so what you're describing is True Lies. I'm
of the age where Jamie Lee Curtis was like a contemporary of mine growing up. Yeah. So that movie is all that for me. I'm just saying, I'm laying that out up front.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I get it. So you've got True Lies, and so you've got a very different sort of spy, but presumably we might have butterflied in a little better segment or sentiment to Reagan as opposed to Ford in 76, but we haven't butterflied away Watergate, presumably.
Or Vietnam.
But
so can a Republican still win in 76?
Well, if you
but all I said was the nomination.
Dylan's got something.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you did.
So you may be able to, and this is something that I just thought of thinking about the comparison between Richard Nixon and like a Casino Royale sort of suave James Bond. Depending on how this sort of iconic American secret agent image is portrayed, Nixon may not have to do Watergate to try and win up the election in 72. He may be able to play on, depending on how this sort of American spy imagery goes, his own past. This is a shout out to some people that on the Discord that we had a discussion about a while back. There's a conversation that I was in with some people about Richard Nixon's gambling history in World War II, believe it or not. Imagine, and I'm just going to set the stage. I'm going to pull in Eric Bond and kind of set the stage here. Imagine a movie sort of set in World War II. You've got a sort of Pacific vibe, maybe a Macau kind of, luxury sort of resort for the GIs. You come in, it's a smoke-filled room. You've got a card table, and sitting at it is a Richard Milhouse Nixon in his military, relaxed uniform, sort of, rolled up sleeves, untucked shirt, and he bluffs a lieutenant with a pair of twos. This is actually a thing that happened. This is how Richard Nixon funded his first congressional campaign. He beat a lieutenant that he was playing cards with on a pair of twos out of like $2,500 or something like that. So you can actually conceivably in this alternate universe imagine that Richard Nixon has this sort of suave bad boy American spy imagery to play up, where he may feel confident in himself that he doesn't have to go. Now, notwithstanding that Richard Nixon is probably still the kind of guy who would go break into Watergate, he may not feel that he has to because he's got this sort of suave card player spy energy to fall back on to win him the 72 election that then gets Reagan in 76.
If you don't change the 60 election, you do not change Richard Nixon's personality in 68 or 72.
Agreed.
But you give his PR people something much easier to work with if you bring up the story about the card game.
Well, the
fact is he didn't have to do Watergate in 72.
He didn't have to do
it.
He was gonna. Nixon was always gonna win 72 in a cakewalk.
Does though the plumbers get looked on more favorably from an American public that's predisposed to this guns blazing American spy?
Now, hold on for a second, though. The plumbers and what they are doing is more British, is more James Bond style than
correct.
What I've assumed we're talking about. They do not use any violence. They do not blow anything up. They do not go in the American way.
Right.
So how are they? How does this help them?
It's still a spy. It's a spy game, and it gets spun as a spy game because now American spies are more accepted and not viewed as a bunch of bumblers.
Especially with somebody who's as rabid anti-communist as Nixon in a world where the pop culture is tuned much more towards anti-communism instead of a generic evil spy mastermind organization.
And all I said was he got the nomination.
Yeah, he doesn't have to win. He just has to get nominated.
And then if he gets the nomination and loses, does 80 never happen?
So hold on. So what's the timeline for 76 again?
So 76, Reagan gets the nomination, but all of Chris's stuff holds true where Watergate, Vietnam, etc. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter is still going to win no matter what.
Yeah, agreed. Given those set of circumstances.
But Reagan, because the Republican Party says, nope, you had your shot. You don't get a second one. So Reagan can't get the nomination in 80. So they nominate Bush, 41?
Maybe. Against Carter? Still? Yeah. So here's the thing. So if it's Bush, and who is surrounded by, it became an overlapping crowd of people,
right?
But he had Bush had his own people, and they were different from Reagan's people,
very much so.
What would happen with the Iran hostage crisis? So what would have been the resolution of that? Would there have been an effort to stall?
No. I think the Iran-Contra still happens the way it did.
No, not Iran-Contra. That's later.
Iran hostage.
Iran hostage. And here's why I say that. The Iran hostages were released under Carter, period.
Yes.
Carter did everything to get them released that got them released. The only reason that Reagan is in the discussion is because he had technically taken the oath of office.
Timing.
By the time that the plane touched down, it was solely.
It was January 20th.
Yes,
it was literally January 20th.
Exactly. Yeah. So the hostages are still released. The one thing that's going through my mind is, and I will say this: George H.W. might be an American James Bond.
Oh,
he ran the CIA.
Dad was the Bush family is despite W's good old Midland boy accent, they are as American aristocrat.
Yeah, he's from Connecticut.
LBJ
was the last Texan ever elected.
Yeah,
Okay.
correct. Agreed. So interesting. Okay, so what happens? So does Bush win in 80? Or does Carter win a second term?
I think if you ask me, Carter wins the second term.
I actually agree with that. I think Carter wins a second term.
Yeah, but
And then
Bush
I
didn't
think-
have the political skill to win.
I don't think he did
Against-
either. And it was a very different sentiment at that point. But now you have Carter, who gets his second term, so he's 8 years in office, but you have this kind of, we'll call this a bubbling sentiment for more conservative elements of the US political spectrum, for sort of this sort of muscular intelligence that, in all honesty, Carter didn't embody. And so what does that mean for 84? So because I would say in 84, I think it's unlikely that I don't think Mondale ran in 84 and lost to Reagan. I think if Mondale runs in 84, even with Carter as 2 terms, I still think he loses. But to who?
Would you have maybe another like Ted Kennedy run?
I still think. I think Ted Kennedy I think if he had his shot in 80, and he didn't get it then, I don't think he would have got it. I just think he had too much baggage.
I would think the one thing I'd say is, looking at the Republican Party, you had 64 where they snuck in Goldwater. And there was constantly this building within the party of an organization of more social conservative, more Reaganite than Bushite.
And so do you still have that? Is there still that moral majority sort of building up? Do you have
I think it is constantly building up. I think maybe Reagan making it in 76 is him blowing his personal chance.
Yeah.
But I don't think it necessarily I don't necessarily think we're thinking about
the movement doesn't die.
The movement doesn't die. Those people are still there in the party. And so you have somebody else coming forward.
Pat Buchanan.
Nobody jumps to mind.
So that Pat Buchanan, because didn't he run in 88?
He did.
So would he run in 84 instead?
Potentially. He wouldn't win, but I definitely think maybe he runs, but he doesn't win it.
He runs in the primary?
Yeah, he runs in the primary.
I think he definitely runs in the primary, but the question is who else would be there? So then I'm going to throw in another name on the Democratic side that I think would be better than Mondale, or at least stronger than Mondale, and that's Gary Hart.
But does monkey business happen?
Yes.
What's up?
That's the question right there.
100% monkey business comes out.
Yeah, it does. And so, but that's the thing is does it come out late enough that he gets the nomination?
Or what about one of the other guys who at least tried in 84, John Glenn? If we're going in this theme of sort of an American spy sort of backdrop to everything, John Glenn is, he's a pilot. He's a guy.
There you go. That's the one.
NASA.
He did run. And he wanted to be president.
He's got more of this sort of muscular American sort of like machismo to round out the 80s. I mean, he could literally cosplay as Top Gun.
Okay, I like that. So you got 84. Yeah. So you have a conservative Republican Party. You don't necessarily have a standard bearer for that. Carter's term limited, and so in 84 you have John Glenn. So let's end it there, guys. So Glenn
wins, by the way, no matter who the Republican is at that point.
Yeah. So we have killed off Ian Fleming in a U-boat attack to Jamaica in 1942,
42.
and we end up with President John Glenn. Well done, guys. Well done.
I told you I was saving one, and when I dropped it, you watch where this episode is going, and when I start talking about Philby, it's like, wait, what?
That's great. Well, so that I have to say, guys, this is a worthy episode to reboot us. It was a little lighter episode, but we still had a lot of good historical context for that. So that's great. Any last minute comments from anybody? Any last minute thoughts before we wrap up for the evening?
I do have one last minute thing, and it's just real quickly going back to the idea of sort of the American spy movie main actor in a franchise. And I know we talked about Elvis, and I'm going to have to show my Memphis colors here, but there's one other possibility from a Sun Studios alumnus, no less, who could potentially have played that. He was never really an actor, but he was in Intelligence in World War II, or shortly thereafter. Does anybody know?
You talking about the first man to find
Johnny
out
Cash.
about
Stalin was dead.
No. The first man to find out about Stalin's secret speech.
Yes. Just imagine the
West.
introduction of the first James Bond movie. You know, Sean Connery sitting at that table, but imagine Johnny Cash instead in a suit with the cigarette, playing cards. It's the same attitude.
No.
Do we have Ring of Fire playing?
No, listen, Johnny Cash was actually working for Air Force Intelligence as a radio intercept officer.
Yes, he's the first person to find out Stalin died.
Yes.
Yeah, that's his bona fides right there.
That's really interesting. Well, that's a great send off, Dylan. I appreciate that. So Chris, Robert, Dylan. So thank you for joining me tonight. This was a lot of fun for a reboot. So for all of us who are listening, or for everybody who's listening, thanks for tuning back in. So this is our kickoff of A Fork in Time. We will have a Room Where It Happened coming up very soon, and we will start getting in the swing of things. So we will have regular programming for you guys. We hope to have another live stream. I think all of us on here who are joining the live stream had a lot of fun with that. Dylan will get the pleasure of being not just part of the audience, but part of the cast for that next live stream. So we really hope you'll join us for that. And we will make sure that everybody knows when that will be. You'll have plenty of warning for that. Don't worry. So we will get everybody involved in that. So thank you for joining us tonight. So before we sign off, we'll say we will end as we always do. So Dylan, if you see a fork in time, what do you do?
Take it and don't stick it in the turkey, like I said the last time.
Don't stick it in the turkey. All right, everybody. Thank you guys for joining me tonight, and thank you all for listening. Good night.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.